Well, it is the top of the hour now, so I think we are going to kick it off and get started. As much as I would love to continue to learn more fun facts about Philadelphia and where everyone is from, but I just want to say a big welcome to everyone to this webinar on digital equity for your website, what it is and why it matters. And for those of you who are not familiar with us, we are Moncito, powered by Civic Plus, and we provide an all-in-one web governance solution to help you find and identify issues and errors on your website so that you can easily correct them. And a few quick housekeeping rules before we kick it off. So first of all, if you would like to make use of the live transcription from Zoom, that has been enabled. So if that is a feature you would like to take advantage of, please do so. In addition, the recording of this webinar will also have closed captions, and we will, as always, of course, send the recording and the slides after the session, but please do give our team a few days to process the recording, get the captions on there, get all the great alt text on the slides. So we do appreciate your patience, as it does just take us a few days. And then, of course, we encourage questions of all kinds. We will address them at the end during our Q&A session, but please do feel free to drop them in the questions panel as we go along, and we'll address them at the very end. But just to be sure, do drop them if you can in the questions panel and not the chat, because I know you guys are all really interactive in the chat, and so it's easy for us to miss a question if it gets lost there. So Q&A panel, and we'll make sure to either address it live or follow up with you afterwards. A quick introduction to us as speakers, a little bit backwards, but I'll go first. My name is Jasmine de Guzman. I am the manager of revenue marketing here at Moncito, powered by Civic Plus, and I am working with webinars, thought leadership, getting you guys all up to speed on all the things that you can do with your website and improve it, make it inclusive, make it accessible on a daily basis. And with me today, I have Jillian Alls, and I will let her introduce herself.
Hello, everyone. So excited to be here. I'm so thankful that you took an hour out of your day to join us today. My name is Jillian Alls. I am the VP of Marketing for Commercial International Partnerships. It's a mouthful here at Moncito, powered by Civic Plus. I mean, I would say that my job is being the team's #1 cheerleader, but basically my position here is just to support the team and drive our goals from a communication and marketing perspective, which includes a lot of talk around our website and accessibility and so forth. So I've been in the B2B kind of marketing space, but more specifically the website space, well, most of my career, but definitely the past decade, coming from a CMS platform and now Moncito. So it's one of my favorite topics, and I'm super excited to be with all of you today.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Jillian. So I just want to take you guys through our agenda today. We are going to, as I mentioned, be talking about all things digital equity. If it is not something you are familiar with, don't worry, we're going to give you an introduction and kind of break that down for you to define it. And Jillian will be doing that. After that, we're going to look at what you need to address as part of digital equity, via digital inclusion on your website. I'm going to walk you through some of the things that we think are super important for you to be thinking about. Jillian's going to take us down through a deep dive of the Digital Equity Act and some other recent developments that have been happening. And then we'll walk through some of those both short and long-term tips to help you improve your website and just try to achieve digital equity. And we'll round it off with the Q&A. And with that, oh, of course, we do just have to give a little bit of a disclaimer. We will be going through some things from a legal point of view. So if there are things that you need to really understand for your specific situation, we of course encourage you to consult with your own legal counsel, because every situation is different. So we will give you, of course, high level information to point you guys in the right direction, but we do always encourage you to have someone who really can look at your own specific legal situation. But with that said, I'm going to launch a quick poll for any of you who've joined us before. You know, we love to kick it off with a poll. And I'm going to let Jillian walk you guys through it while I launch it.
All right. So when you hear the phrase digital equity, what comes to mind? Is it just another buzzword for digital inclusion or something like that? Is it something you're very familiar with and already address in your organization today, including on your website? Or is it a totally new topic for you? Welcome. That's why we're here. Or, oh no, what do I have to comply with now? So what comes to mind? There's no wrong or right answers. It's no judgment here, and just trying to understand where we're at so that we make sure we can address everyone's kind of situation from today.
We've got about
Good.
70% of you have answered so far. Answers ticking in pretty quickly. That's fantastic. Gonna give it another 5 seconds or so, and then I'll make sure to share the results with all of you. All right, I am going to close the poll now, and I am sharing the results.
All right, it's just another buzzword, 14%. We already addressed digital equity inclusion in our organization, including our website, a whopping 31%. Awesome, that's great to hear. This is a totally new topic, 43%. I love it. You're here to learn. Let's do it. And oh no, hey, I've been there. I get there. We are, based in Copenhagen, and we've got plenty of regulation in Europe too. So sometimes it feels like it's half my job, but that's not what we're necessarily. I can already tell you, spoiler alert, specifically around digital equity, it's nothing to do with compliance. It's more holistically just the right thing to be doing. And it's, what we're here to talk about today. So thank you for being honest. Thank you for joining. Really excited to talk to you all about digital equity today, because for me, this is the bigger concept, like the bigger umbrella that is most important when you're looking holistically at making your website better, making your society better, making your, engagement with your local government better. It's really what's going to push the needle and give that condition. Here is the definition, in which all individuals and communities have the information technology capacity needed for participation in our society, democracy, and economy. So it is the goal. The National Digital Inclusion Alliance defines digital equity this way, but it's evolving, and we want to talk a little bit about that. So what do we mean by digital equity evolving? What is it kind of today? So it started absolutely with the access to technology. If we rewind, I don't know, I'm going to age myself here, but 30 years ago, it was like, oh, how do we get computers into classrooms, and how do we get computers into the homes? And then quickly it was like, okay, this thing called the internet is really taken off. How do we make sure everyone has access to the internet? And then whoop-de-doop-de, the internet is just commonplace, but how do we make sure people have equal and access to viable internet connections, because everything gets more complicated, and listening to that AOL dial-up was getting pretty tiring, and we needed viable connection speeds. And along this path, it's just pretty obvious that there's some discrepancies, right? And then it's culminating at this point. It's not culminating because it's evolving and growing, but right now, a lot of what we're looking at is like the skills you need to actually utilize this technology. And that's a lot about what we're going to talk about today. But if you're joining this webinar today, it's likely that you have all of these 4 things listed on the screen, at least today. And maybe you're all lucky enough to kind of not imagine a world where you don't have those things. It's a little bit of privilege, but really for many of us, it's almost impossible to imagine. But there's a lot of reasons for it. So a major one, of course, is access. So this digital divide kind of started out just the access to broadband internet. It's not available everywhere. There's just some people that can't get it based on where they live. But more increasingly, so it's associated with cost. So maybe, broadband's readily available, but it costs money, and it's a barrier for a lot of low-income households. And then digital skills, I mean, even with an understanding of its, technology and internet's importance, there are simply individuals who lack the skills to utilize the technology. And it might be because they're from a different generation or they have a disability, but it's a barrier. And that makes it difficult to promote digital literacy. So we're going to dig a little bit more into that on our webinar today. But also want to just talk kind of why it's important. I mean, might be a no-brainer, but I just wanted to go through it. So digital equity is necessary for civic and cultural participation, employment, lifelong learning, and access to essential services. It literally impacts our entire community, your life inside and outside of work. This is something that touches everyone all the time, every day. Education is probably the most obvious example of this, and COVID, or the pandemic, if you will, really shined a light on this. But if you don't have equal access amongst your students, there is a huge gap. Like sometimes the digital divide has been dubbed the homework gap, because there's certain students that just could not do their homework online because they either didn't have access to the internet or they didn't have reliable access to this connection speed they needed. to accomplish the task, or they didn't have the technology they needed. Not every school doles out tablets and laptops to their students. So that was a pretty big eye opener. And it will set people back already from, childhood, really, if we're not implementing more around digital equity for education. Societal growth, of course, digital equity promotes essentially just more economic growth and societal growth. So digital literacy can have an impact in everything from how people read the news to how they interact with their government. And, as you interact more with your local government, the more likely you are to get engaged in your, civic, I don't want to say responsibilities, but, the civic engagement that we're all hoping and striving for to make stronger communities really boils down to like how you're accessing information. Healthcare outcomes, huge one. So rural hospitals, for example, they might not have access to broadband internet, which limits their capability to a lot of advanced technology for imaging and telehealth, or even, some of these other more imaging technology, et cetera. So funny enough, rural areas are the best candidates for telehealth because you've got patients that are far from the local hospital, yet don't have the ability because they don't have the access, right? And then if you flip it over and think about the patients themselves, we're so quickly evolving towards digital only communication in a lot of regards. Even post-pandemic, there's so many digital experiences that have remained digital because people have realized, oh, it's so effective. I can do more with my day. This is awesome, but not for everyone, right? So I think it's about putting ourselves in those shoes more often. So for me, when the pandemic hit, my father, who has a disability, I had to help him with everything, like teach him Zoom, teach him Microsoft Teams, teach him this, teach him all the things. We all know it, right? Everyone has a different system. And for him, he was just like, what is this? And he's still continuing to use a lot of that technology now coming out of the pandemic. So it's something that we all need to think about. In terms of economic development, the more broadband there is in these non-metropolitan areas, the higher association with job and business growth. So there's statistics around that. And of course, higher employment leads to less stress on our social systems, which is a positive thing. So you could even argue that investing in digital equity pays itself. And finally, safety and security. So online methods being a really main form of communication these days that people rely on, including the police, the fire department, other essential services. If you don't have access to that, you are putting yourself at more personal risk in a natural disaster, or, if there's a fire locally, flood, active shooting, God forbid. So I think there's so many components you really need to think about when you think about digital equity. So that is like really up in the helicopter, if you will, of looking at what digital equity is. So you might be thinking, okay, thanks. What does it have to do with my website? And we'll get there next. So thank you for sitting in with that on me. But so if digital divide is the issue and digital equity is the goal, the work is digital inclusion. So the work that we can do, so you and me, we might not be able to, install broadband internet somewhere where it's not, but you and I can look at our website and figure out how can we make sure that our website performs well if it's accessed on 3G or 4G, these kind of things. So digital inclusion is the work. So this slide for me is really the takeaway, right? If you want to keep it super high level, I thought this was a really helpful kind of graphic, if you will, to consider. So if we look at what it means specifically for your website, so now we got to go to work. We got to do the digital inclusion thing. That's the work we need to do. And it looks at a number of different things, and Jasmine's going to walk you through each one individually, but it's looking at your things like your page speed on your website, the mobile experience, web accessibility. We talk a lot about that. Of course, that is included. The reading level of your content, the use of inclusive language, and more. We're going to ask you guys to participate as well. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to Jasmine, who will walk through each of these in a little bit more detail.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Jillian. And I know that probably some of these things seem very basic to you, and maybe you've thought about these from different perspectives, but we're really going to walk through each of these aspects of how you can improve your website from a digital inclusion point of view, with the ultimate goal being digital equity. And so the first thing is, of course, page speed. And so this is just one of the things that you need to think about addressing. And of course, you're like, page speed, but I'm not the one controlling how fast my audience's internet loads. And that is absolutely true. Of course, like Jillian said, you can't go to someone's house and install broadband and make sure they have a great connection. But what we can do to make sure that your website is equitable to access for everyone is making sure that you're doing those small tweaks that makes it quick and easy for it to load, even if someone has a slow connection. And the reason that this is so important from a digital inclusion point of view is because, as it says here, the lower a household's income is, the less likely they are to consistently subscribe to a wireline broadband service. Again, as Jillian mentioned at the beginning, before digital equity and digital inclusion was about making sure that people had access to technology, and maybe that was going to a library and being able to use public internet. But nowadays, it's about how you're accessing it from your home, and that's something that we've just continued to see, especially throughout COVID, where people weren't able to perhaps perform their jobs from home because they did not have fast enough internet. And beyond that, 25% of the US population still does not have a broadband internet connection at home. And as Jillian also mentioned, one of it is perhaps you're in a rural area and the infrastructure is just not there. Yes, the government is looking at what they can do from an infrastructure point of view to improve that. But again, that's not something that we have control over. What we have control over is making sure that it loads as quickly as possible. But beyond that, it also affects different people in our society in different ways. So if you look at it, 66% of Black adults and 61% of Hispanic adults have broadband compared to 79% of white adults. So yes, it seems like page speed is such a small, minuscule thing, but it does impact digital equity on a much broader level. And then of course, age is, age is also another factor. So of course, we're looking at minorities or people who are living in rural areas, but age and demographics as well of people are also impacting. So there's also a lot of people, as Jillian was mentioning with her father, that who are older and do not have as readily available access to the internet. And that's where when you are working on your website, simplifying and making it as easy as possible is one of the most important things you can do. And I'm just checking my notes to double check I didn't forget anything. But the important thing is just to think that, yes, it may seem like a small thing to do, but you can disproportionately affect a lot of people if you're not thinking about page speed on your website. All right. The next thing that we wanted to address is the mobile experience. And so a lot of people are thinking, well, mobile experience, isn't that just mobile get-in, which is Google's big algorithm updating to prefer mobile websites a couple of years ago? Of course, that's one of the factors. Of course, you want to make sure that your website is being able to be found by search consoles. But the other very important thing to consider is that a lot of households do not have the luxury of having a laptop or a desktop at home. And some households are mobile first, where I'm particularly inclined to do certain things on my laptop. That is not an option for everyone. And with that said, your website needs to serve those people as well. So again, disproportionately affecting people lower households with lower incomes, different minority groups, even certain geographies in our country. 38% of Louisiana's population during the 2018 census did not have use a desktop, laptop, or tablet. And that means things like applying for educational grants or applying for parking permits in your local neighborhood, things that would typically be easier to do on a laptop or desktop, they may not be able to do because they do not have access in the same way, but must access your website through a mobile device. And that's also why a mobile experience is such an important part of ensuring an equitable experience for everybody. All right, next thing, if you've ever listened into any of Moncito's webinars before, you know that web accessibility is something that is near and dear to our heart. And we'll dive a little bit deeper into it in a little while, but web accessibility is is the important work to accommodate all site visitors regardless of ability. And I think I saw a really great graphic by Microsoft the other day on designing for digital inclusion. And that is because web accessibility, while we consider it to be something that you maybe perhaps have to do by law because of the Americans with Disabilities Act, it can also create a really great user experience. So it can be and web accessibility can help people not only born with a disability, but it can also help people who have developed them over time, who have a temporary disability, or even a situational one. I'm just going to give you an example. A permanent disability can be someone who's born without one arm, and therefore they are not able to use a mouse as they regularly would, and then perhaps use some kind of screen reader software instead to navigate your website. That is a permanent disability. A temporary disability, which has very much the same effect, could be if you broke one arm. I know one of our team members injured their arm, and her experience in how to work and navigate a computer was completely different with an injured arm. And a situational experience could be, and I know we have a lot of parents out there, how many of you did not sit at home with your kids in one arm while you're working during COVID? That is a situational one. You are, again, navigating and need a accessible user experience to get things done. And I think beyond just understanding that it can really impact and benefit everyone, is that it does affect 26% of US adults. And it also, again, disproportionately affects US adults with a disability who are less inclined to use a desktop or a laptop computer, or in fact, sometimes not ever go online, leaving them out of the scope of receiving digital information via your website. Reading levels. This is another important element that's often overlooked. We are becoming an ever more educated society. We are writing more text. There's never been more content out there, but really academic or text-heavy text, which I know, especially when you're visiting local government websites or a higher education website, trying to decide which university you want your son or daughter to go to, it can be a barrier for some people, and especially those who have English as a second language. The higher the reading level that's required on your website, the less likely the community will understand and engage. And a really important thing to note as well that a lot of people underestimate is that the average US adult reads at an 8th grade reading level. So by making your reading level too high, too complex, too difficult for people to understand and not in plain English, essentially challenges people from getting the information that they need from your website and really understanding how they can easily engage with you. Beyond people not having necessarily a higher reading level, for a lot of people, English is their second language, or maybe they're bilingual. So 20% of US residents over the age of 5 speak more than one language at home. And another thing, which it doesn't necessarily have to do with language, but just with the society we live in today, is that we want to consume information quickly. We look at headlines, we look at bullet points to quickly consume the information that's on our website. Our attention spans are shorter than ever. So really academic or text-heavy content is a barrier for many people, because they're not going to sit down and read your website or your web page as intended, step by step, line by line, word by word. They're going to skim it until they find the information that they need. And that's also why you need to make your content as short and to the point to be inclusive of everyone and making sure that they're receiving the information that they're looking for. And last but not least, before I hand it back over to Jillian, is to talk about inclusive language as part of your making your website inclusive. And language is one of those interesting things, right? Language that you're familiar with, that someone in your family uses, or the people around you use, can very much increase trust. It can make you feel like this is something familiar, it's something I want to engage with, and you feel comfortable engaging with. On the other hand, language can also have the opposite effect. If someone's using very difficult or words that are unknown to you, words that you don't understand, it decreases the trust, it decreases the willingness to engage. But beyond that, language can also introduce bias and also be problematic. So for example, one of the fun examples we have in here, because digital equity doesn't have to be all dry and boring, but a great example in pop culture is that Lizzo and Beyonce were both recently called out on lyrics in some of their songs that were ableist. And I think one of the great things that we're seeing in our society is that people are not only looking at how do you make your websites more inclusive, but how are you making our music and our pop culture more inclusive. And I think going forward, this is going to be something that continues to be important. Again, this isn't a topic that we were talking about maybe 5-10 years ago. It's a new trend coming with young people, with 25% using neutral pronouns or a combination to refer to themselves. So I think we're just seeing the very start of this here. And another important thing is that 64% of survey respondents took action after seeing an ad they considered to be diverse or inclusive. So think how powerful that can be for your community. Think about if you are appealing to people, then you are able to create a better community. You're able to engage with people on a stronger basis, and to being able to build trust and create a more equitable experience for all. And what's more, we're always learning. We're human. We know more than we knew yesterday. And all of these things that I just mentioned, if you haven't addressed them yet, we're going to give you some tips on that, so don't worry. But we also just want to hear, what are some of the other ways you suggest that we could all be more inclusive on our websites? Because these are just a couple of examples, and these are also the examples that we're going to tackle in terms of actionable tips. But this is just the start of it, right? These are all things from a website's point of view. So we'd love to hear what else you guys have. And I can see there's some questions ticking in. So if you have any of those in the meantime, please feel free to tap those in. I can see there's a great suggestion here is inclusive images. Absolutely. Seeing more diversity on our websites is another really, really great example. Less stock photography, more real people, more diversity amongst people. Let's see. Do we have anyone else have any great ideas? I can see someone was asking about how to get an idea of your reading level. I'll be giving you guys some tips on that, though. I do see one of our great team members did try to give a couple of tips in the chat already. So thanks for that, Michael. But yeah, great. I don't think we have any more, but maybe a few of you will chat a couple more in a little bit. But I love inclusive images. That was not one I had considered. So absolutely think that's a great one for everyone to consider going forward as well for their websites. And I will hand it over to you, Jillian.
Thank you. All right, so I get to be the one that hops back up in the helicopter, taking it, just up again. So we were kind of talking about the website, but wanted to touch quickly on what's the government doing in all of this. So there is something called the Digital Equity Act. This is something that the National Digital Inclusion Alliance has lobbied hard for. Their positioning standpoint is a quote here. I'm just going to read it. Increasingly, Americans require broadband internet connection to live, work, and interact. Yet far too many individuals, many of whom are members of historically overlooked and underserved communities, lack the skills, technologies, and support needed to take advantage of the opportunities made by a reliable broadband connection. So hopefully this rings a bell from what we were talking about at the beginning of this webinar, but that's the basis where they came from when they put together this Digital Equity Act. And I'm happy to say that it is a bipartisan passed bill as part of the the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act. You just get to the next slide for me, Jasmine, please. Thank you. And like I said, spoiler alert, it doesn't include any compliance requirements for you as an organization as such. In fact, not the opposite, but it provides funds essentially to tackle some of the biggest issues within establishing digital equity and solving that digital divide. So the Digital Equity Act that they kind of put together was hoping for funds to address the things here in this graphic that I'll just read out. So they want access for digital skills training and education to low-income populations, improving online accessibility for social services, especially for those with disabilities, and empowering rural communities with the ability to measure and address their own broadband needs. So that was passed actually a year ago, pretty much to the, I don't know about to the date, but it was August of last year. So what that resulted in on the next slide is $2.75 billion over 5 years across 3 different grant programs. So if any of you are joining us from a government agency today, if you're not already familiar or you're not involved, I would definitely encourage you to speak with some of your colleagues about anything you can do to apply for some of these grants to address this in your local communities. But that said, there is some stuff coming out of the Department of Justice these days. So they've had 2 big announcements this year. In March, they came out with their official guidance for addressing web accessibility. Remember, web accessibility is part of this digital inclusion, which is the work to achieve digital equity. So some in the accessibility community felt like that wasn't enough, that they had hoped for more actual rules and regulations to be more explicit about what does an accessible website mean, look like, contain. The general guidance has been under WCAG 2.0, but there's never been an enforceable rule. It's been an interpretive rule. That's going to change. So just 2 weeks ago, the DOJ came out again, this time, and said, hey, listen, we're announcing our intent to do rulemaking around the accessibility of websites under Title II of the ADA, American with Disabilities Act. And that is suspected that it will spill into the ADA Title III, which is around private businesses, as there's many precedent for that happening. So, the government does care. They are, maybe more slowly than people wish, making changes, but there is some legal implication of, digital inclusion around website accessibility. And that, I was just say, if you've been on our webinars, we talk about it, but honestly, it's the right thing to do. So yes, you kind of need to know what local rules and regulations you need to adhere to be compliant and to avoid, legal action. But ultimately, this is the right thing to do. Everything that Jasmine kind of discussed previously and is going to dive in with tips and tricks on next, it's going to benefit everyone for your website. It's, rising tides raise all boats. So everything improvement you make doesn't just benefit someone with a lower income, crappy internet service. It benefits also someone who's on the go and is like, I don't know, hiking, but needed to remember to apply for school lunch or whatever it is. Parents are always forgetting things. But it's going to benefit everyone that visits your website, your entire community. And that's what equity is about. That's why I am very passionate about talking about equity, because it includes everything that makes things better. So with that, I will hand it back to Jasmine to dive into the nitty gritty, what you're all here for. Maybe get your notebooks ready.
What I hope you're all here for, and what I hope is a little bit new and a little bit of things that you're hopefully already doing. And I can see there's some great conversations going on in the chat as well. So I did just want to read out one of them, and it's very close to a touch point I'm going to touch on, but one person contributed that readability can also help folks who use translators to access websites. I've encountered some families where adults were unable to read their native language and had to translate everything and have it read aloud. That is a fantastic example of why readability on your website is so important, as well as accessibility using a screen reader to read things out loud. So thanks for sharing that. And I know a lot of people were echoing that was a very interesting point that they had not considered. All right, great. So diving into the tips to improve your website for better digital equity going forward. The first one that I mentioned before was talking about page speed. And so page speed is perhaps one of those things that you've already tackled and had a look at, and now my notes are not cooperating. There we go. But the first thing that you really need to look at from a practical point of view to improve page speed is you need to evaluate your website per Google's Core Web Vitals. So Google's Core Web Vitals is something that came out earlier this year. They introduced some new metrics, and those metrics are especially hyper focused on page speed. And I'm going to read them to you. They're a little bit techy, a little bit heavy, but don't worry, you can Google and find a little bit more, but they are largest contentful paint, and that is how quickly your page essentially loads, how quickly the user can see something on your website. The next is first input delay. How quickly does your page load so that they can interact and do something on the page? And the last is cumulative layout shift. It's a mouthful, right? But cumulative layout shift is how quickly, you know, when you load something and things on the web page are moving around, how quickly does that settle? And so all of these things are different aspects of improving your page speed. And it sounds simple. It sounds like improving page speed. How quickly does it load? But here, Google's really broken down page speed into micro metrics, if you want to call them that. And those are things that you need to also think about when you're evaluating your page speed. So if you have not already optimize your website for Google's Core Web Vitals, that is absolutely something that we recommend that you do, and it can have a big impact. I'll have some links for you later on as well on how to access that, of course, so don't worry. Of course, beyond looking at Google's Core Web Vitals, it's also important to think about how people are accessing your website, which is something that we're talking about at the beginning, what technology they're using and what devices they're using. And so there's a lot of different ones that can be, are they accessing via mobile or desktop? It's important that you simulate these different types of connections as well to understand how your website performs, as well as mobile speeds. For those individuals that are mobile first, are they accessing via 3G or are they accessing via 4G connection? And what does that experience look like for them? And beyond that, websites are hosted on different servers around the world. And so your location can also have an impact. If you're based out of Idaho, but your website is loading from a server in Japan, that can also impact your page speed. So understanding and knowing where your website is loading from could be incredibly important in changing the equity of the experience. And then, of course, what about, whoops, skipped ahead a little bit there. And then, of course, setting up rules for content that impacts page speed. We know that in most organizations, as such in our own, we are not the only ones uploading content to our website. You may have other content creators who are putting blog posts up, or you might have another department that's responsible for their own subsection of pages. And I think there's a couple of things you can do there. Is setting up rules to ensure that they're adhering to best practices that positively impact page speed. So things like making sure that no images are larger than X amount of size, because we all know that large images and someone uploading it all of a sudden unaware of the file size can significantly impact your page speed. And then, of course, things like image format as well. So Google has also in recent years been promoting a new web-friendly image format called WebP, and updating all of the images across your site may seem tedious, but again, can have a huge effect on how quickly your website loads. So that is the first kind of actionable tips around page speed. The second thing, kind of a little bit interconnected, is of course mobile experience and how to improve that. And I think first things first, when was the last time you tried browsing your website via mobile device? I know some of us prefer accessing everything via our desktops. Some of you perhaps already are primarily using your mobile devices to accessing your website. But if you as an individual who works at your organization finds it difficult to browse your website via a mobile device, then chances are it's probably going to be pretty difficult for everyone else as well. So I think using your own kind of gut feeling going in, what is difficult for you, what are improvements you can do, can be kind of the first initial way to improve the mobile experience. Beyond that, I know I mentioned the mobile get-in, Google's big push for making all websites responsive a couple of years ago. I know most people have tackled it, but not everyone has. So beyond making your website responsive for a better user experience, it also helps your Google ranking. And so if that is not something you have tackled yet, I absolutely highly recommend you doing it. And on top of that, there are also accessibility benefits for it. We actually just launched 2 new mobile accessibility checks, which have to do with the layout of your website and it being responsive. And so those are also important things for making sure that you have a great mobile experience. And again, going back to being realistic, we know that you are probably not the only person working on your website, and there are other departments who are involved. So if you have a website style guide, make sure that mobile is not an afterthought. Make sure mobile is part of all of the checklists. So if you have a designer that you work with to design your web pages, make sure that when they're designing a web page, they're not just doing the standard web page, but the mobile version too. Again, as I mentioned before, accessibility. You need to look at the accessibility of your full web page as well as the mobile version. Content creation. A giant chunk of text may look nice and read really well on a desktop version, but what about the mobile experience? What about being able to quickly skim that page for information and find what you need? And just the overall optimization of your website needs to be thought about from the mobile point of view if you want to deliver an inclusive and equitable experience, because the reality is, and probably even more so going forward, there will continue to be a lot of users accessing your website via mobile devices. All right, as I mentioned, web accessibility, always near and dear to our hearts. I know I've touched on it a couple times already, and if it is a topic that is new to you and you really want to deep dive into it, our July webinar was on web accessibility for beginners, the basics for success, and I definitely recommend you check it out. But as Jillian said, there's been some big developments in the web accessibility space with the Department of Justice coming out with some new announcements this year. So one of the most important things that you can do to improve the web accessibility of your site and ultimately offer a more inclusive experience is audit your site against WCAG 2.1 AA standards. And for those of you who are already very familiar, you're thinking, why am I saying WCAG 2.1? Because the Americans with Disabilities Act currently refers to maintaining a WCAG 2.0 AA standards, but these new announcements are indicating that there could be potential for it being updated, or the compliance part of it being updated for compliance with the WCAG, which again, I should actually spell it out, is the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines, version 2.1 level AA standard. So definitely audit your site against those if you're looking to improve website accessibility. Do both with an automated scan, that's something we'd love to help you with, but also a human check, because those are probably the next steps, and that's kind of the gold standard in the industry right now. The next thing is, of course, and these all fall under the realm of those, is tackling those common web accessibility issues. Sometimes it's really small things that you don't realize you're doing over and over again. And I can see there's some people who've been commenting on some of these things already, but one of them is missing alt text or putting text into images and forgetting to add alt text. Alt text is incredibly important for screen readers to be able to identify and explain what is being shown. Color contrast issues is another common issue, as well as a missing skip to content function. So those are just some of the things. And if you're not 100% familiar with what I'm talking about, again, check out our July webinar. And then of course, for improving your web accessibility, again and again, it's a journey, not the destination. So you always have to reprioritize and prioritize your most visited content, and make sure you're going to those pages where you're getting a lot of traffic. If you're launching a new page, make sure that's up to speed. If you're launching a big campaign around it or launching a new section of your website. And then of course, don't forget PDFs and other documents. Anything that's uploaded online counts as website content. All right, great. Hanging in there, got two more kind of actionable tips for you guys. So how to address reading levels. And I've seen some of you guys talking about how important this is. So first of all, one of the things that we like to recommend is working with tools like the Hemingway app to assess reading levels as you write, because those long, really complex sentences are not necessarily something that everyone understands. A second tip is have a non-native English speaker read your website. If you're unsure if it makes sense, making sure that someone who has English as a second language understands it could be a really good stepping stone. Don't have a non-native English speaker working with you, maybe think about if you have a child or teenager at home, would they understand your website content? It is, after all, their native language. And as we mentioned before, the average US adult only has an 8th grade reading level. So if an 8th grader doesn't understand it, the general public might not either. And then this last point I really love, because it was very similar to what one of you mentioned, is with reading levels, translation is also a great way of how to figure out if the readability of your website is easy enough for everyone to understand. So one of the tips that I've heard and I've tried is take what you're saying in English, put it into Google Translate, translate into another language, for example, Spanish, and then take it and translate it back into English. And if it still makes sense, it's simple enough, concise enough for people to understand. And I can see someone here saying as well that that person always tries to think of her grandma trying to read the website. I love that. That's a great tip. So that is reading levels for everyone. And last but not least, how to incorporate inclusive language. And I think similar to accessibility, a lack of inclusive language on your website is not ill-willed or maliciously done. It's simply a lack of understanding, a lack of education, a lack of awareness. So I think this first step for everyone is make sure you have an internal understanding of what you as an organization see as inclusive language or as non-inclusive language. Make sure everyone who is producing content or even just through internal communications educated and building awareness around it. Some of the other things as well that I think are, again, kind of superfluous throughout our pop culture, throughout our society, is prioritizing things like person first language. So instead of putting the person at the back of the phrase or the sentence fragment and saying a disabled person, what we really want to do is flip it around and say a person with a disability, because it is the person who is at the forefront and at the center of everything. Being aware of ableist language is another important thing to think about when you're looking at inclusive language. So a really common phrase and example that I've heard is saying someone is wheelchair bound. Wheelchair bound has an incredibly negative connotation and an ableist connotation, because wheelchairs are actually something that provide a lot of freedom for a lot of people. And saying wheelchair bound has a very negative connotation. So being aware of that is also very important. I have a few great resources for you. And I can see someone else also just shared one from the National Center on Disability and Journalism. So that's fantastic. Thank you so much for sharing that. And then of course, set up alerts for non-inclusive language being used on your website. Again, being realistic, you're not the only one publishing content on your site. So whether you're doing this through Google Alerts to make sure someone's not using a phrase or some terminology in your industry that's common, but not necessarily inclusive, then you can get alerts with it and help them correct it and address it over time. If you're a Menzido customer, that's something you can already do through our policies tool, which is very powerful and helps you just kind of flag and keep an eye on making sure nothing is slipping through the cracks when it comes to inclusive language on your website. And here's all of those different great resources to help you get started: Google's PageSpeed Insights, Google's mobile friendly test, a couple of our accessibility tools, the Hemingway editor app, and then some inclusive language glossaries. And I think we will add the one that someone just shared here as well. But this will all be sent to you in a couple of days along with the slides. You can check out all of those links. And with that, I will give it over to Jillian to wrap it up.
Thank you, Jasmine. I know that was a lot, but you powered through, and hopefully everyone hung in there. There was a lot of great stuff in there, and there's a lot of things that can seem overwhelming, but I think, having a plan, building that awareness, or building the awareness, creating a plan, and prioritizing based on, what's going to have the biggest impact first, and what are your priorities within your organization is the best first foot forward. So just wanting to wrap it up, digital equity, again, it encompasses more than just access to technology. It's evolved, continues to evolve, not just because the digital divide is getting bigger or anything, but just because it's becoming obvious and more apparent that there's more things to address than just simply internet connection when it comes to bridging this divide. And all the things that you can do to make your website more inclusive, regardless of regulation, is where you should start in terms of what you can control, right? We can't go dig the fiber net up or, for it, but we can improve our website so that our community can engage with us. And digital inclusion is always the right thing to do. So I'll leave it at that as wrapping it up. We've got lots of questions and great things in there. We're going to just start collating. I think Jasmine's going to be our killer moderator on questions. So in the meantime, just going to launch a quick poll here at the end. We'd love to help you get started on this journey. So just quickly let us know if you're interested in how your website meets digital inclusion standards or practices today, finding out if your website has any kind of major errors when it comes to WCAG 2.1 AA, seeing a demo of the platform, or all of the above.
Awesome. And I'll just leave that open in case people just need a little bit of time to read through them, and we can start the Q&A. And I think the first question is for you, Jillian, and it was just, what was the name of the organization that you mentioned in the beginning that the definition of digital equity came from?
Ooh, I want to double check really quick because I think it was the National Disability Inclusion Alliance, but it could have also been, hold on.
No worries. We'll let you.
I think the point I would just make on that is there's no official, this, you know, it's not really Webster's dictionary. I think the important thing I would take away from what we're saying is that it's evolving, right? That definition continues to change a little bit. So can dig that note up, but I believe it was that.
Great. The next question that we have is, how do I communicate higher technical information on a portion of the website without causing problems for others?
Ooh, Jasmine, do you want to take this one? I feel like we addressed this in our web content webinar, but I wanted to say I remembered the proper answer for this because this came up, and you know, we had a content writing for the web expert on a webinar earlier this summer. And if I remember what she said, she really recommended at least a summary at the top that spoke very high level about what it contained, and then include the content underneath. Do you remember that the same way, Jasmine?
Yeah, I was going to say, there will of course be portions of your website that are more technical in nature, that need to be more technical in nature. And that is simply because the audience or the intended audience for them are probably people who understand it. And I think making it clear that this is a guide for local park inspectors on how to do something very specific, the more, and highlighting that this information is specific to someone doesn't necessarily mean it can't be on a public forum. Of course, it can be on a public forum, but really identifying who that information is for and writing it in the technical level that they understand is completely fine. Of course, making sure that your language is plain and simple and inclusive for everyone is as important as possible for those very popular pages on your website or information that needs to be generally widely available. But if it is for a technical audience and you need to provide them with technical information, that is absolutely, of course, okay. But as Jillian said, great to put a little summary at the top, really highlighting who and what it's for, and maybe even some contact information if they need a little bit of help understanding it better. I hope that answered your question. We have another great question, which is, how do I provide an inclusive experience for a map-centric information? I'm not sure I 100% understand this question, Jillian. I think I
understand it. I think I will be the first one to say I'm not an expert on that. I would kindly hope to come back to you maybe outside of this webinar. We have some better experts in those kind of deep level details when it comes to web accessibility. It has come up on other webinars. It is the trickier one. It is problematic, especially a lot for local government that has a lot of map specific content on their website. So there is an answer, and I will chase it down, and I won't pretend to be the expert on that.
Oh, perfect. And that's totally fine as well. We will follow up with you because I can already tell the next question is a great one. And it is, do you have specific information about what maximum image sizes and formats? And I do not have them off of the top of my head, but I would love to chase up those answers for you. We do have them somewhere. We have experts who know. I will say as well, though, that when you are running your website through something like Google PageSpeed, they will also tell you, or Core Web Vitals, it will tell you specifically which images as well, and recommend what sizes there are as well. So they should be able to help you as well, but I'd love to follow up with an answer for you as well.
Yeah, and I think on that, you also want to just kind of double click a little bit into your CMS and see what your CMS provides, like if they auto compromise images or not. So yeah, we'll definitely find those resources, but it's not necessarily everyone with the same answer. which is
Yes.
many things in life. Jasmine, there were a bunch of stuff that came in chat. I don't know if you've been scrolling through.
I have. There's been a lot of great stuff, but if there's anything that stands out to you first, feel
Well,
free.
there was one, and I'm trying to find it. It was just like, what if the inclusion on the site doesn't exactly represent the inclusion of our company? Hey, I feel you. I think there's a lot of organizations that struggle with this. I don't have the perfect answer, but what I would say, what the place I'm coming from, and luckily in our organization we have this, is, these DEIB boards and initiatives within companies, getting people together to have the conversation. What does it take to attract that talent? How do we retain it? How do we build awareness in the company or the organization? Sometimes, your company is only so many people. And so, it's like Jasmine said, not ill intended, but it starts with awareness and figuring out if there's anything you can start doing in your local community to start driving more inclusion and diversity into the workplace.
Great. And I can see there's a lot of great comments and great takeaways as well. I can see a lot of people have also highlighted that what inclusive language and what inclusion means in their organization is something that's not necessarily clear cut. It's something that they are actively having conversations about within their organizations. And that just shows how important that collaboration and building that awareness around everything is important. So another great question is around if there are certain CMS platforms that are better suited to handle checking for things like this around digital equity. I think certain platforms probably have certain things built in for accessibility, or they have certain things built in for language, but of course, it's always great with a myriad of tools. For example, the Mencedo platform, we really bring together to scan your website, not only your website, but across multiple domains. So if you're managing more than one website, we scan all of those and we try to bring that all together from a web governance, digital inclusion point of view, looking at that content readability, looking at accessibility. But there's also certain things that can't be scanned for on a CMS or a platform point of view, which is things like your content creation. That's where you need to work proactively and establish website guidelines. But on the other hand, what we can do and what platforms like the Mencedo platform can help with is help you set up policies to make sure that you're flagged when people are not following those rules or not following those best practices. So I know one of our most commonly used policies on our platform is making sure that images over a certain size aren't uploaded, and that you as like the website master or web admin can be notified and help the person and help educate the person in another department how to make that image smaller. And the same thing goes for anything on the language point of view or accessibility errors or page speed. So there's definitely platforms. I don't necessarily know if there's one platform that's better than another. They all have different pros and cons, but we definitely think that a platform like ours is, of course, a suitable complementary platform to a CMS because they are handling so many other things for you. And I think with that, I think we're going to wrap it up. We'll follow up if there's any other questions in the chat that we did not get to. We will follow up with you. And I'm just going to close this poll as well. There was our Q&A slide, but here is, of course, as well, both mine and Jillian's information. So if you have any questions, feel free to reach out to us. Feel free to connect with us on LinkedIn as well. I know as well that our amazing customer success team also said that if any Mencedo customers are in here, they're always available via the chat support, and you can book an online training with them as well. So feel free to do that. But we just want to say a big thank you to all of you for joining us. And we hope that you are more well-educated and more ready for the path of digital inclusion on the way to digital equity. So thanks, everyone.
Thank you so much, everyone. Have an amazing day.